All right, welcome back to Intro to Activity-Based Costing from IME 239, Part 3. We closed out Part 2 by going over this example where we had two activity pools, baking and frosting. We directed the overhead or indirect costs into the activity pool based on how those costs were being consumed or used by the activity. We then developed the activity rates, the rate per cost pool, and then we developed product costs based on how much of that resource, how much of that activity the product used. So you can spend some time looking this over on your own as well. All right, then really why are we using activity-based costing? So I want you to take some time to read this information above that I'm circling here, which is what I pulled off of Wikipedia, and describe how activity-based costing relates to what you learned in 223 and what you've learned so far in IME 239. So place the video on pause for a few minutes, write down some of your responses on how activity-based costing is related to IME 223, Process Improvement Fundamentals, and what we've talked about here in IME 239. All right, hopefully you put it on pause. Welcome back. Some of the items that I have down is activity-based costing, as I mentioned in the prior videos, is just another way of another version of product costing. So hopefully we believe a more accurate and better management tool than what traditional product-based costing is, which is what we've learned about earlier in 223. We're also assigning activities, so that means that we've observed the process, so that would fall under a method study, which is something you learned about in IME 223, so that we're understanding how the product is built and being able to make some improvements from that. Hopefully activity-based costing is telling us how to, or directing us, guiding us on how to improve the use of indirect costs related to the product. And we also use it as a tool for internal managers. So this is something that we talked about back at the beginning of the quarter for IME 223. This is not something that any company that I've ever heard of will be sharing with the outside world because it provides a lot of proprietary knowledge in how they build their product, how their cost structure is, but very useful for internal managers to help manage their area of responsibility, whether it's a department or a product. Ultimately, it's the product cost, as we know, is the most important. And it's simply another tool to aid in overall process improvement, which is the whole scope of IME 223. So we really could possibly add this as a tool in IME 223. And it also helps to eliminate waste because we see where we're wasting not just direct material and direct labor resources, which is pretty easy to see in traditional costing since they're done the same way as activity-based costing, but it now helps to identify waste in the indirect or overhead cost as well. All right, so hopefully you had some others, and if you did, I would love to hear about them in class. So let's move on to another example, just to go through and reiterate the format is really what I'd like to call this of activity-based costing. So again, remember I talked about before that direct material and direct labor, also known as prime cost. So this is possibly new terminology that we haven't talked about yet. Prime cost is another terminology for direct cost, whether it's materials or labor. And so easily directly traced, directly identifiable to the particular product, and so those are driven to the product in activity-based costing the same way as they are in traditional product costing. And we did some examples in class of that in traditional product costing. And it's the factory overhead or the indirect costs which are different in activity-based costing than in traditional. In traditional, remember, we just took this as one cost pool, the 600,000, and we would divide it by the number of units, the number of machine hours, the number of direct labor hours. One driver though, not multiple drivers based on what was driving these costs, but just one driver. Whereas in activity-based costing, we take these factory overhead costs and we look at how those costs are consumed by each activity. And so in our part case, we had baking and frosting. In this case, we have the activities driving this product are machine setups, the machine time that it's running, the inspection, and the packing. So we've taken overhead costs the same way we did in the cake example, and we've said, okay, of those purchasing costs, for example, how much of those go to machine setups? How much of those go to machine running? Of the engineering management, how much of those go to machine setups? How much of those go to inspecting? Of the supervision on the floor, how much is attributed to running the machines? How much is attributed to packing? All those kinds of things. And it takes some detailed analysis, by the way, to correctly and get consensus from all parties involved on how those indirect costs are consumed or used by the different activities. But now you can see we have these four overhead cost pools, four activity cost pools, and that total sum is the same $600,000, but it's just now the overhead is grouped by the activity that is driving, consuming, using the overhead cost. And then you can see for each pool we've developed a rate. Again, all of these costs are forecast, something we projected for the next year, quarter, what have you. Typically it's going to be for a year. These activities are all projected. We have an activity level that we build the overhead costs on, and then we drive the overhead costs into the different pools, and then we develop the rate per pool. So machine setups, it's a cost per setup, which makes sense. Machine running, it's dollars per machine hour. Inspecting, dollar per, I would assume that's labor hour. And packing is dollar per order, which seems to make sense. And so then depending on how the product, whatever this GSV is, depending on how many setups, how much machine time it uses, how much inspecting it takes, and how many devices get packaged, that will determine what the product cost is. And you're going to see some examples in the next slide. Oh, well, not the next slide. I'll talk about that in a minute. You'll see some more examples. So we also want to discuss what the pros and cons of activity-based costing are. So the pros, as we've stated before, and hopefully this is becoming evident, is it helps to identify inefficient products, departments, and activities. So it helps to understand where indirect costs are being used effectively and where maybe there's a little bit of slush and things could be managed better or managed better. It helps to allocate more resources on profitable products, departments, or activities. So when we understand the true cost of a product, so go back to our cake example where when we just allocated traditionally, we had a flat $536 per cake. But when we broke it down into the two activities of baking and frosting, we saw that the complex cake that took a lot more detail of frosting in actuality cost a lot more because the frosting labor spent a lot more time on it than the flat cake, single layer, just one layer of icing. So you can make better product decisions on that, right? And understand which one is profitable, how much profit, and let's consider this little quiz. Really gross margin, I'll give you the answer, how much gross margin is for each product, right? And then helps control costs at a per product level and per department level. And then through that you should be able to identify and eliminate unnecessary costs. So those all sound great. What are the cons to it? The cons are it depends on estimates. But that's the same way with traditional product costing too. It all depends on estimates. We forecast the cost into the future. We're forecasting what the activity is. And based on those assumptions, we're calculating what the product cost is, whether we're in traditional or activity-based costing. So that's kind of a neutral between the two. The second con is that it's costly to implement. Because you can see it takes a lot of additional work, maybe have some system changes you need to make, or it just takes more time for the industrial engineer or cost accounting group to be developing and analyzing that information. And then it's also complex to explain, as you may or may not think after listening to these three videos combined and the next two videos I'm going to ask you to watch. So it's not just as easy as overhead cost divided by units, right? You have to understand and be able to explain how you're driving the overhead costs into each activity pool, why you have those activity pools in place, etc. All right, so that's the end of the information for the introduction to activity-based costing. The next two slides, which I'm just going to go over briefly because they're also posted as assignments for you on PolyLearn, is I have two videos that I'd like you to watch and some questions here that you need to answer about those. And so in class we'll discuss the answers to these questions, and I also want you to develop your living expenses in traditional and activity-based costing methodology. And you'll understand more what I mean by that when you read this video, when you watch this video. It gives an example of two guys going on a trip that I thought was pretty interesting. And so you can think about that for your living expenses too. And I'm not suggesting you go talk to your roommates about it, but maybe you might want to. And the next video, which also is going to be posted on PolyLearn for you, is going through two more examples, I believe. And you can see here that I have some questions for you so that we can be sure that you're understanding how activity-based costing is developed and derived. And doing a little sensitivity analysis down here in number 5, which is really what happens in real life. Things aren't always what we project in the forecast, right? So what does that mean? So those are your in-class activities, and you have all the information you need, I believe, to do that. So we'll look forward to seeing you and working together on activity-based costing.